Let's talk Baldur's Gate 1. Technically, I actually did some work on Shattered Steel. I wrote an installer that never got used. This was actually before I was even technically legally working for BioWare, so it doesn't show up on any records anywhere. Baldur's Gate is the first game that I worked on where anything actually saw the light of day. Perfectly rational to consider it the first game that I worked on. So the year is 1997. I actually got hired by BioWare in December of 1996, but I didn't graduate until May of 1997. So that's actually when I started at BioWare. One of the very first things that I did was to build my own desk. And I think that actually provided a lesson that served me well, which is that you do what needs to be done. You may be in a senior position, you may be someone who is a leader or who have people reporting to you, but if something needs to be done, sometimes you're the right person to do it, and that's the right call. Later in my career, I often had large teams around me, but even still, there were occasions where it was worthwhile for me to be the person that got coffee or moved a desk. I was the person who could most afford that time. I'm pretty sure the first official dev-related thing that I did on the project was to actually build the conversation system for Baldur's Gate. It's got some weird idiosyncrasies, and it leads to a few other topics. The conversation system for the Baldur's Gate series is actually based upon the speaker as opposed to based upon the conversation. When I implemented it, that made sense to me. Everything that one person says all gather together. But if you think about it a little bit longer, you realize that that actually doesn't make a ton of sense because it means that files are having to cross-link to each other constantly. It's pretty hard to visualize a single conversation based upon that structure. Additionally, the conversation system needed a way to determine which lines would fire. And this is where the genesis of BGScript came from. BGScript is the scripting language that I wrote for Baldur's Gate. It originally was designed to be used specifically for deciding which lines of conversation to fire. I'd never written a scripting language. I'd never taken a compiler course. I didn't really have any idea what I was doing with writing a scripting language. But this scripting language, I thought, only needed to do something very simple. It was basically just an if test. It is a very limited scripting language. It doesn't have an or. It doesn't have for loops. I believe it's technically Turing complete through various shenanigans. But I think there's another lesson here, and we'll be coming back to this one. I read a long time ago that if you make a scripting language, it's going to be used for things that you didn't intend it to be used for. I knew this at the time that I wrote BGScript, but I also assumed that someone who actually had taken a compiler course was going to write a better scripting language that we would use for all other purposes. This isn't actually what ended up happening, and BGScript ended up being used not only for the conversation system, but also for the AI of the creatures for combat. Again, that lesson is if you make a scripting language, it's going to get used for other things. We will come back at a later date on a later project and talk about an even worse scripting language that I wrote that got used for things it wasn't intended to be used for. Another interesting thing about the conversation system is Biff the Understudy. Those of you who are very familiar with the Baldur's Gate series probably are aware of Biff the Understudy. Biff the Understudy is a character that spawns if a conversation is happening and one of the speakers doesn't exist. So rather than the conversation breaking, it spawns a specific creature that stands in for the person that is missing. Now, this should never happen because there should be scripting in place to handle missing characters if someone has died, but there were cases where this didn't happen, and Biff the Understudy is a backup. I actually think this is an incredibly important lesson, which is you probably should put those suspenders on. There's no real reason in most cases why you shouldn't have the null check on your memory address reference or have a Biff the Understudy just in case. I know you're really clever, I know you've handled all the cases, but it doesn't really cost that much to have that extra little check. Now, this isn't always true. If you're in the middle of your graphic loop, you probably don't want to be doing constant null checks for things that are running a billion times a frame. But in most cases, assuming you're a little bit less clever than you think you are is probably going to serve you well. Another thing that I was responsible for on Baldur's Gate was most of the gameplay and combat loops. I implemented the primary AI loop, where it handles the combat round. Baldur's Gate uses the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons system, which uses a combat round. Back in the day, TSR sort of implied that a combat round was about a minute long, but most people pretty much treat it as if it's 6 seconds, and that's pretty much what is canonical these days. That is as well what we implemented in the case of Baldur's Gate. It's a 6-second round, and the primary central loop was implemented by me. A bit of an aside, do people actually remember that Dungeons & Dragons was actually made by a company called TSR that got bought by Wizards of the Coast way back when? Is that still a thing that people remember? Or am I just the oldest person? My analytics would say that I am the oldest person on this channel. An interesting little factoid is there's a tiny little exploit, because the way the round is counted, it actually counts the round for spell casting and for weapon attacks separately from each other. I believe, if I recall correctly, the reason it does this is because you can get multiple attacks, and we didn't want to just have those all happen at once, which wouldn't look very good. It needed to be able to partition the round up differently, whereas you can only ever cast one spell in a round. So as a result, it keeps track of them separately. The consequence of this is that if after you cast a spell, if you're using a relatively slow weapon, you can actually get an attack in the remainder of the round if you're super quick. Another thing that I am infamously known for at BioWare is I'm actually the creator of the 2DA. So what's the 2DA? For those of you not in the know, the 2DA is simply a two-dimensional array. On Baldur's Gate, the 2DA was simply a flat text file. It evolved and got more complicated and became more elaborate file formats over the years, but my intention was always something that was easy to read and easy to use. The 2DA has become a much maligned file format at BioWare. In fact, it's been expunged from development completely at this point, but I actually believe it's an incredibly useful file format. It gives you something that very quickly allows you to add new kinds of data into your project. However, if it gets used incorrectly, it is a problem. The 2DA, as I envisioned it, was always intended to be read in and parsed into another data format. It wasn't intended to be held open and referenced in real time. As you can imagine, holding a text file open and referencing different parts of that as if it's an array is not particularly efficient. It was always intended to be used and transformed into something else. Second edition D&D has a lot of tables, and the 2DA is designed to handle that. So I guess my lesson on this is that it is useful to have a way to quickly add new kinds of data to your project. Because it is essentially editorless data entry, in a way, 2DAs are kind of another form of a scripting language. And over the projects, you started to see 2DAs referencing other 2DAs, referencing other 2DAs, essentially giving you four-dimensional arrays, tesseracts of data, if you will. But again, I believe that that is the format being used incorrectly. In those cases, you want to create an actual editor that actually allows people to manage their data properly. But anyway, 2DAs forever. It's the best. I love them, and everyone else is wrong. Something that I use the 2DA, and a form that I think is very good to have is we had an end screen system. So you would have a list of screens with how long they would show and text that would go up on top of them. And you would throw this into the override folder. And then as the game is running, you would trigger this and it would just show a series of screens in order with text on top of them with specific times. This is excellent to quickly add screens to an end of a demo. I guess this brings up something else, the override folder. All the way up until we started to use Unreal, all of our engines had the concept of an override folder. An override folder is literally that. It's a folder in the hierarchy of the game where if you put files, they would be read and they would be used preferentially over the files that were built into the data structure. I love the concept of an override folder. It gives an agility to the project that I think you lose when you have to package everything together. Frostbite doesn't have the concept of an override folder, and neither does Unreal. We were looking at certain points in time in adding this sort of thing into Frostbite. We never did get around to it. I love the concept of an override folder. It allows you to do things when you're out in the field, doing demos or at trade shows. It also gives you the ability to have developers do things quickly. It can get overused, and you can get cases where people never update their game and just throw more and more and more into the override folder, which starts to drag down your speed. But I do think it is something that is useful, and I miss it in modern engines. I hope you're following my stream of consciousness, because the override folder actually brings me to something else, which is the concept of updating. When we first started on Baldur's Gate, there was no tool for actually updating the game. In order to get a new version of the game, you had to go to a folder and copy everything down. And we thought, oh, well, that's easy. No one can mess that up. We don't need a tool. Turns out, actually, lots of people can mess that up. And we very quickly realized that you need a tool. This is the kind of tool that you definitely want to have. And actually, I think you want a little bit more to it. I think you want ways to force people to update. You want ways to potentially tell if people haven't updated. And if you do have an override folder, you want a way to force that override folder to be emptied on occasion, though you probably should warn people before you do so. So a couple of weird things about the actual shipping of Baldur's Gate. I've talked about this on Twitter a little bit. Baldur's Gate actually shipped in debug mode. We could not, in the last days of getting ready to ship, figure out why we had this crash that occurred randomly. It didn't happen in debug. It only happened in the release versions of the game. So we basically took the debug version and optimized it as best we could, and that's what shipped. Now, it turns out that the thing that was crashing was there was a piece of uninitialized memory that was being nulled out by the debug mode. That's what was causing the crash. And we found that in the development of Baldur's Gate 2. Another thing is that we used MFC a little bit in Baldur's Gate. For those of you unfamiliar, this is the Microsoft Foundation classes. It was mostly used for debug purposes because it's not the most efficient, or at least at the time, it wasn't the most efficient set of classes. In the main AI loop, that loop that I was talking about that handles combat, which runs on every single creature and every single character, every single frame, there's a C-string constructor right there in that loop, because there was a problem with something to do with Minsk. So it constructed a C-string, set it to be Minsk, and then did a comparison in order to see if it was Minsk in order to try to find a bug. All that comparison and everything was commented out, but that C-string constructor was actually there. And back in the days of Baldur's Gate 1, when you're running on a Pentium 166, running a C-string constructor and assigning it to something many times a frame was significant to frame rate. When we found that and removed it in Baldur's Gate 2, it actually added 3 frames a second back to the frame rate. So I guess the lesson to be taken away from that is, sometimes you just do what you need to do to ship. There's no such thing as a perfect game. There's no such thing as done. Sometimes you just need to get the game into the state where it can be shipped. Now, you might come back later and see that you've made mistakes, and you might fix those, and that's great. But if you look for perfection, you're never going to find it, and you're never going to ship. Baldur's Gate was made by a team that didn't really have any video game experience. We had some people in the building who had shipped Shattered Steel, but other than them, none of us had actually worked in the game industry at all. And I don't think that actually hurt us. I think that allowed us to do things that otherwise would have been impossible. At that time, CRPGs, so RPGs on PC, were largely considered to be a dead genre. This is back in a period of time where Diablo was considered to not be an RPG at all, but it actually was. We were working on Baldur's Gate before Diablo even shipped. So between Diablo and Baldur's Gate 1, I think that those two games are responsible for maintaining and returning computer RPGs into an important position within the video game industry. I think that naivete, that lack of experience, is what allowed us to do things that otherwise people would have said or known were impossible. So I do think that being willing to work on things that you don't have experience with can be incredibly powerful and incredibly freeing in terms of allowing you to do things you wouldn't otherwise do. On Baldur's Gate 1, I was in a relatively low position. I wasn't a lead of any sort, so I don't have a ton of memories about interacting with publishers or the like. But one thing that I do remember is that we did, during the development of Baldur's Gate, show it off in Seattle at a location, I believe it was Wizards of the Coast had a special building, a special store where they had an arcade and a bunch of other things like that. It's been closed probably for almost 2 decades now, but that was amazing, and that was one of my first experiences as traveling for business. When we were in the final stages of Baldur's Gate, probably really more than a year, most of the time that I was on the project, we were working overtime. This is probably the longest crunch I've ever done on any project. We, I guess, didn't know any better in part, but also this was early days for BioWare. We had no reputation, and we had agreed to certain deliverables, and we were in part doing this to get paid. We had pizza for a long time. In part, it was because, as Ray Musica has said, he didn't actually realize that other food was available to be purchased. I don't believe I ate pizza for probably 4 years after Baldur's Gate shipped because of that. And I think there is a lesson there about the small things mattering. I think the welfare of your team, even through little things, can be improved in little ways, and each little removal of friction is worth considering. If I was entering the video game industry now with the skill set that I started at BioWare with, I think I'd probably be entering as a technical designer or a gameplay designer because, as I said, I'm the one that actually did most of the work for the core part of the gameplay in Baldur's Gate. But back in 1997, that wasn't a discipline that even existed. At BioWare, when we started out, we were tool makers first and foremost. We recognized that role-playing games are built out of tons and tons of content, so the engineering was focused around making the delivery of content more effective and more efficient. Tales of the Sword Coast was actually the expansion pack for Baldur's Gate. This is back in the day where you didn't really have DLC to speak of. Actually, there was no DLC at all, really. You had expansion packs or nothing at all. Expansion packs needed to be big enough to be sold at retail, and Tales of the Sword Coast certainly was. Tales of the Sword Coast was built to be played at any point beyond basically the prologue of Baldur's Gate. And there are really 2 approaches to expansion packs. You can either do it that way, make an expansion pack that sort of integrates into the story, or you can make something that comes after the story and continues on from there. The expansion pack for Baldur's Gate 2, Throne of Ball, works that way. There are pros and cons to each. By integrating it into the story, you allow people who haven't finished the game to enjoy it immediately, which is good, but the problem is that it also means that it can't really impact the game that much overall. So you end up with a more accessible but less impactful product. I think because of the nature of the industry at the time, this was okay for Baldur's Gate, because one thing that Interplay was really good at was keeping products in stores and keeping them in stores at full price. So we would have Baldur's Gate in the store, then we'd have Tales of the Sword Coast in the store at $40, and then we would have Baldur's Gate and Tales of the Sword Coast packaged together at $60. And I saw these games in stores years later still selling for $60. And I think that is something that more recently has become incredibly rare. Prices tend to decline much more quickly than they used to. I don't actually have a lot of memories of Tales of the Sword Coast. I think those memories have been mixed with and lost in amongst the other memories I have of Baldur's Gate. But it serves as the source of one of the most powerful pieces of advice I ever got. Tales of the Sword Coast is when I became a lead programmer, and there was an incident where I lost my temper in a room full of people with Ray and Greg there, and afterwards they took me aside, and the thing they said to me was to only lose your temper on purpose. The lesson there is so important. It's not always something you can do, but your emotions are a tool, and when you're in a leadership position, when you're in a position of power, you need to be careful about how you use your emotions, how you display your emotions to other people on the team. Well, you made it to the end. I hope you enjoyed this walk down the fractured parts of my memory. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there is a link in the description. If you are interested in picking up some merch, there should be a shelf below this video as well to check that out. Both of those things help the channel to keep running. I hope you enjoyed this view of Baldur's Gate. It's the first game that I did any significant work on, and really the one that put BioWare on the map in the first place. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up because that shows YouTube that it's worth spreading it to more people. What are your most vivid memories of Baldur's Gate 1? Did you ever play it? Are you looking to play it now? The footage in this remaster are actually from the remastered version of Baldur's Gate. It's pretty hard to find the original out there, and I didn't want to install it off of CD because I think I'm missing one of the CDs. Put your memories down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.